What would you do if Putin finally lost it? So frustrated by his lack of progress in his special military operation and the enormous amount of aid Ukraine has received from the West, he finally decides he has no other option. It's time to pull out the big guns, the nuclear missiles. It's a question many of us have been fortunate enough not to really have to think about since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. But the sad reality is that nuclear war with Russia is now much closer than you might think, especially after Putin did something that makes it easier to justify launching nukes at the US and its Western partners. What is that something? That's one of the questions we're going to answer in this video as we explore why we're closer to nuclear conflict with Russia than we have been in decades and whether Putin will really push the big red button. Rattling the nuclear saber is something that Putin has done plenty of during the war against Ukraine. Threats of a nuclear war drawing closer have been rife, especially when Putin talks through the mouths of the likes of Dmitry Medvedev. The deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council has more than once made the nuclear threat, including an instance in March 2023 when he said a nuclear apocalypse was coming into view. However, those threats were just that. Calculated coercions Russia was trying to use to dissuade the West from crossing its many red lines in the war. As the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace points out, this type of dangerous nuclear rhetoric has been coming out of the Kremlin since February 2022. The use of tactical nuclear weapons inside Ukraine has been mentioned multiple times. Back in April 2022, Putin's administration was warning of potentially deploying nuclear and hypersonic weapons if Sweden and Finland join NATO. Both are now members of the Collective Defense Organization. Russia didn't respond by sending nuclear weapons the West's way. It's this talk followed by a lack of action that leads many commentators to suggest that Putin was employing little more than cheap threats to get his way in Ukraine. Threatening to use nuclear weapons and actually using them are two very, very different things, this camp would argue. So far, any threats of using nukes appear to have been bluffs by Russia's leader, all designed to help him get his way in Ukraine. But that has all changed, and that brings us to the something we mentioned earlier. On November 19th, several media outlets reported on a significant change to Russia's approach to its nuclear arsenal that has brought the world closer to nuclear war than it's been since the Cold War. AP News was among the first to report the changes. It says that Putin has officially lowered the threshold for Russia to use its nuclear weapons by implementing a new doctrine that makes it easier for Putin to give the okay. The key takeaway from these amendments is that Russia has now permitted itself to use nuclear weapons if it feels its sovereignty is being threatened by a joint attack from a non-nuclear nation and its nuclear partners. Specifically, the participation or support of a nuclear power in any strike on Russian territory will now be seen as a joint attack on the Russian Federation. Notably, Putin has also extended the protection that Russia's doctrine provides to Belarus, acting as though he's making that commitment per the Union State Agreement the two nations signed in 1999. Roughly translated, this change means only one thing. Russia could target the United States with nuclear weapons for supporting Ukraine. After all, the US is a partner to Ukraine and has been providing weapons to the country to use to defend itself against Russia. The same goes for France and the UK. Both are nuclear powers that deliver aid to Ukraine. However, the change in Russia's nuclear doctrine has come so far into the Ukraine war, not because these nations support Ukraine in defending itself, but because they've done something to anger Putin. They've allowed Ukraine to use weapons they provide on Russian territory. Specifically, the formalization of Putin's new nuclear doctrine can be traced back to 6 letters. ATACMS, ATACMS. Just days before Russia made its doctrine change, the United States finally granted Ukraine permission to use its long-range ATACMS missiles inside Russia. Ukraine quickly put that new permission to good use, firing off 8 of the American-made missiles at the ammunition depot in the Russian oblast of Bryansk on November 19th, mere hours after Putin made his nuclear changes official. The ATACMS attack marked the 1,000-day anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it was intended to send a clear message to Putin: we can now hit you with powerful missiles inside Russia. Putin anticipated this. Reports of President Joe Biden's decision to reverse his long-standing policy of not allowing Ukraine to use American-made missiles had circulated just a couple of days before Ukraine's strike, and it's now clear to see that Russia approved its new nuclear doctrine as a direct response to that policy turnaround. That's what the mentions of joint attacks and threats to Russia's existence through conventional weapons are for. The doctrine is a warning to the United States that allowing Ukraine to use its powerful missiles against Russia could now be grounds for a nuclear response. In one sweep of a pen, Putin has just plunged the world closer to nuclear annihilation. However, it's important to point out that Russia's new nuclear doctrine doesn't actually come as too much of a surprise. Putin first tabled his proposed amendments in September 2024, with the news from November merely telling us that the amendments have been made official. US State Department spokesman Matthew Miller said, "I'm unfortunately not surprised by the comments the Kremlin has made around the publication of this new, revised document. The US knew the amendments were in the works, with Putin likely waiting until the US gave him a reason to sign the new doctrine into law." Miller says that the change is just another example of how Russia seeks to coerce and intimidate both Ukraine and other countries around the world through irresponsible nuclear rhetoric and behavior. For its part, the US isn't planning to make any changes to its own nuclear doctrine. Neither is the UK. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer was quick to decry Putin's move as well, pointing out that the irresponsible rhetoric coming from Russia wasn't going to stop Britain from supporting Ukraine. Nevertheless, Russia's doctrine changes signal a huge shift in the war. For the first time, Putin has permitted himself to strike at both Ukraine and its Western allies with nuclear warheads if he feels Russia is under threat. He's essentially telling the West that allowing Ukraine to use its weapons on its territory constitutes the type of joint attack that would give him an excuse to use nuclear weapons. The November 2024 nuclear doctrine changes aren't the first that Russia has made under Putin. For instance, the country released a military doctrine in 2010 that seemed to go in the opposite direction of this new version. That 2010 doctrine stated that Russia would only resort to nuclear weapons in two circumstances: the use of weapons of mass destruction against it or its allies, or when facing a conventional weapon threat so severe that it threatened Russia's existence. As Brookings points out, this doctrine was relatively benign. At the time, it was difficult to envision any situation where Russia would be pressed to use its nuclear weapons. Its major nuclear rivals in the US, France, and UK were all unlikely to launch a first strike against Russia, so Russia would have no need to respond. Moscow also seemed unlikely to face any threats to its sovereignty through any sort of warfare, ruling out the conventional arms aspect. The doctrine boiled down to Russia only using nukes if it faced an assault on its sovereignty. Another change came in 2020, when Russia published a document named "On Basic Principles of State Policy of the Russian Federation on Nuclear Deterrence." Again, the doctrine change wasn't seen as a particularly big deal. Moscow made a couple of amendments. It permitted itself to use nuclear weapons if it received reliable data about an incoming ballistic missile attack against Russia or its allies. There was also a condition stating that attacks on critical government and military sites that might undermine Russia's ability to leverage a nuclear response would be grounds for a nuke launch. That 2020 doctrine widened Russia's nuclear scope. It now had a launch on warning policy, rather than one that would see it launch upon confirming an attack. And the proviso of launching if its nuclear sites were attacked covered some conventional weapon use. But again, there was little to suggest that any of Russia's enemies would ever trigger these conditions. Warnings wouldn't matter because the US wasn't going to send nuclear missiles Russia's way, meaning there would be nothing to provoke a response. No Western nation had any reason to attack Russia's nuclear missile sites either. An expanding of scope perhaps, but the 2020 doctrine change didn't represent much of a threat. Then came February 2022. And the launch of Putin's special military operation. Putin's assault on Ukraine was meant to last 3 days, resulting in Russia taking Kyiv and absorbing Ukraine into the Russian Federation. It should have been like Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, a quick fight that led to a Russian victory. If that had happened, we may not be talking about Putin's change in nuclear doctrine right now. He would have gotten what he wanted, and the West would certainly not have invaded the new Russian-owned Ukraine to take the territory back. But that's not how things worked out for Putin. Ukraine put up far more of a defense than he expected, leading to his initial invasion stalling. And when aid started pouring in from Western countries in the form of weapons and ammunition, Putin found himself fighting what he believes is a proxy war against the United States and NATO. To him, that was as good as fighting against the US itself. Ukraine's successful invasion of Kursk in August 2024 brought the war into Russian territory for the first time. This was a big trigger for Putin. The success of the Kursk invasion gave Ukraine a massive morale boost, in addition to leverage it could use against Putin in any future peace talks. Plus, Russia now faced an attack on its territory, albeit not one that could threaten its sovereignty. Putin reacted desperately. He enlisted the help of North Korea, leaning on a cooperative defense pact he signed with the country in the summer of 2024 to bring over at least 10,000 North Korean troops to defend Kursk. That move was seen as an escalation by the United States, with Biden's decision to reverse American policy on ATACMS usage seeming to be a direct response to Russia's use of North Korean soldiers. Knowing how much damage those long-range missiles can cause to key military positions near the Ukraine border, Putin reacted the way he's reacted so many times during the Ukraine war. He made nuclear threats. Only this time he's done it with a doctrine change that is far less benign than those seen in 2010 and 20. Russia can now self-justify its use of nuclear warheads against Ukraine and any of its allies if the Western-made weapons Ukraine uses in Russia threaten the country's existence. So we come to a question: does all of this mean that we are edging closer to nuclear war with Russia? That's a difficult question to answer without considering the reasons why Putin made the doctrine changes in the first place. We've already covered one of those reasons. He fears America's ATACMS and may see the use of those missiles as a threat to Russia. That would explain the joint attack aspects of the new doctrine. Putin is trying to send a warning to the United States in yet another bout of the intimidation tactics he's been using for nearly 3 years. The rhetoric coming out of Russia in the wake of the doctrine change certainly suggests that intimidation is on the agenda. Reuters reports that Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is claiming that the use of ATACMS missiles is a surefire sign that the US is more directly assisting Ukraine. He claims that those weapons can't be used without American data and personnel, adding that Russia will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia and will react accordingly. Lavrov's words were reinforced by Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybakov. He claims that the danger of a direct armed clash between nuclear powers cannot be underestimated, as Russia and the West now find themselves moving through unexplored military and political territory. All of these statements carry with them the undertone message that Russia wants the US to stop assisting Ukraine. It's using its new nuclear doctrine to try and force a reversal of Biden's ATACMS decision to restore the status of the Ukraine war to what it was just a month or so ago. Therein we find another potential reason why Putin has rubber-stamped Russia's new nuclear doctrine. He's getting desperate. We already see this in his decision to ally himself directly with North Korea. Yeah, Russia gets over 10,000 troops from that defensive pact. It's also received at least 100 KN-23 and KN-24 ballistic missiles from North Korea. The first of those weapons arriving in Russia 2023, according to Ukraine. But formalizing a collective defense alliance means Russia has to deliver something in return to North Korea. Cash, military secrets, and even the expertise Pyongyang needs to build nuclear weapons are all potentially on the table. Turning Russia into the country that hands all of these things over to North Korea shows that Putin is struggling to see a way out of the war he started. The nuclear doctrine amendments reinforce how desperate he's starting to feel. It's practically certain that Putin has heard about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's vaunted victory plan. Part of that plan involves the West removing all restrictions on Ukraine's ability to use the weapons it's receiving to strike within Russian territory. That part of the plan is now in place thanks to Biden's ATACMS decision. And with the UK and France following suit by allowing Storm Shadows to be used in Russia, you have to wonder if Putin is concerned that the victory plan will lead to exactly that for Ukraine, a win over Russia. Putin's intimidation tactics haven't worked so far. They didn't stop Sweden and Finland from joining NATO. They failed to prevent the US from allowing Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles in Russia. This change to Russia's nuclear doctrine may be Putin's last roll of the dice to get what he wants out of the Ukraine war, before he may be forced to negotiate some form of peace when President-elect Donald Trump takes office. But the move could also be much more. That brings us back to the question we posed earlier: are we now on the brink of nuclear war with Russia? There are cases for and against. The desperation in the Russian camp we've already spoken about could stretch so far that Putin sees no other recourse but to use nuclear weapons. Pride has always been a big part of Putin's attractiveness to Russia as a leader. As PBS reports, Putin was the spearhead behind the creation of a new Russian identity that combines religion, tradition, and a sense of patriotism driven by military strength. The latter was perhaps the most important part of this triumvirate. And it's that confidence in military strength that's wavering in Russia now that the Ukraine war is coming close to the 3-year mark. Speaking to NPR, Russian opposition activist Alexei Minyalo claims that independent polls show that 84% of Russians would rather Putin focus on home affairs. Support for his special military operation is waning too. 63% want Putin to sign a peace treaty with Ukraine that includes mutual concessions. Putin is losing the support of the Russian people if Minyalo's figures are accurate. He's also been forced to watch his legacy and that of the military he's built get trampled on by a Ukraine that bravely resisted it as it should have rolled right through the country. Could all of those shots to his pride be enough for Putin to decide that he needs to achieve a final and total victory with nuclear weapons? Perhaps. The changes in Russia's nuclear doctrine essentially mean that Russia is on a pathway to operating with no thresholds at all. That's according to Maxim Starchak, writing for the Carnegie Endowment, who says, "The problem is that the lower this threshold becomes, the harder it is to convince anyone that any such threshold actually exists. In other words, the doctrine changes are little more than ceremonial in nature. The decision to use nuclear weapons does not depend on what is written in a doctrine," Starchak opines. It rests on one person, Vladimir Putin. Russia's leader exercises such total control that he could choose to use nuclear weapons at any point, regardless of what the doctrine says. The piece of paper is a threat. The reality is that Putin could launch at any time. We also can't ignore that Russia's threats are becoming more blatant. Throughout the war, Russia has used missiles against Ukraine that could carry a nuclear payload. That's according to senior research associate with Harvard's Belfer Center, Mariana Bajarin. She points out that Russia is using dual-capable systems, such as the Iskander-M short-range ballistic missile. Those have been used extensively in this war by Russia, Bajarin tells CBS. So when we have an incoming from Russia to Ukraine and we see that it's an Iskander missile, we don't know if it's nuclear-tipped or conventionally tipped. Maybe this is yet another one of Putin's intimidation tactics. Or perhaps he's been using these Iskander launches to test the missiles he's now prepared to deliver with a nuclear payload. These signs all point to the possibility of nuclear Armageddon incoming. But there's also a chance that this is all just more bluff and bluster. That's according to Senior Policy Fellow of the European Leadership Network, Rishi Paul, who says Putin has just been pushed into his doctrine change as a consequence of the cautionary tale of the boy who cried wolf. In the ancient fable, the boy cries wolf to warn villagers of an impending attack, only for his cries to turn out to be faked for his own amusement. Of course, when a wolf does actually appear and the boy cries out, he's ignored and attacked by the wolf. In Putin's case, Paul argues, Russia's leader has relied on nuclear threats to stop the West from crossing his red lines, only it hasn't worked. The lines have been crossed repeatedly, and Putin hasn't followed up with nuclear strikes. He cried wolf once too often, and the West still feels confident that it can undercut him without a nuclear response. It's also worth pointing out that Russia is still communicating with the United States about its nuclear weapons. For instance, November 21st saw Russia fire a new experimental intermediate-range ballistic missile at Dnipro in response to Ukraine's ATACMS attack. That missile didn't come loaded with any warhead, except for dummy ones, with Russia seeming to use the launch simply to show the world that it had the missile and it was capable of hitting its target. Nevertheless, Moscow still notified the US Threat Reduction Center about the launch. Granted, it only told the center 30 minutes before the missile touched down in Dnipro, but the fact that any notification was sent at all shows us that Putin is very aware of the possibility, with the US immediately responding with nuclear escalation of its own. In other words, Putin is still actively trying to avoid the possibility of mutually assured destruction if he uses his nuclear weapons. And he should be. The Arms Control Association, or ACA, notes that Russia and the US are operating on a fairly level playing field when it comes to their nuclear arsenals. The US has 5,748 nuclear warheads to Russia's 5,580, says the ACA, though many of those are in the process of being retired on both sides. In terms of strategic warheads, which are those designed to hit settled areas far away from a battlefield and that are already in place, Russia has 1,549, compared to America's 1,419. Simply put, both sides have more than enough nukes to destroy the other, with a launch by one almost certain to be followed by a launch by the other. As it always did during the Cold War, mutually assured destruction may be enough to stop Putin from following through on the wording of his new doctrine. It may be the only thing standing between us and complete nuclear annihilation right now. So we come to our final question. What does Putin do next? Paul believes it's possible that Putin might use a low-yield nuclear weapon against Ukraine, likely touching down in a remote area of the country so it doesn't kill thousands of people. That would be Putin's final warning shot, his last Hail Mary throw to convince Ukraine to give up its fight. But even that is a dangerous tactic. Just because a nuke touches down in a remote area, that doesn't mean the US and its allies would ignore it. Escalation would follow, leading to a tense standoff where Putin threatens to target a populated area next, while the West sends constant reminders about what would happen if it does. At that point, it would all come down to just how desperate Putin has become to complete his special military operation. Would he risk destroying his country through a global nuclear catastrophe? Hopefully not. The BBC's Russian editor Steve Rosenberg has a slightly different take. He believes that any speculation about what Putin does next is precisely that, complete guesswork. Perhaps even Putin doesn't know the answer, which might make things even more serious, Rosenberg says. This comes from a man who once described Putin as being akin to a car with no reverse gear, no brakes, careering down the highway, accelerator pedal stuck to the floor. If that description is accurate, then the West is right to worry about Russia's nuclear doctrine change. Putin can't go in reverse, according to Rosenberg. He can only plow ahead, and right now, he's driving down the most dangerous road of all, the road that leads to nuclear war. But what do you think about Russia's nuclear doctrine changes and what they mean for the future of the world? Has Putin just pushed us a big step closer to a worldwide nuclear holocaust? Or is this more saber-rattling from a Russian president who's trying to intimidate rather than follow through on his threats? Share your thoughts with us in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out The Salted Nuke That Could End the World, or click this other video instead.